And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, today's sea ice analysis showing a reduction of sea ice here around Nunivak Island and again in Bristol Bay. And of course, that's opening the way for possible coastal flooding with those strong winds coming in on Wednesday night and Thursday. So the coastal flood watch out for that area. And of course, Bristol Bay just about open with no ice at all. For tonight, system pulling up here into the Bering Sea, a weak trough over the Pribilofs, and a front pushing rain into the southeast coast with rain and gusty winds along the North Gulf Coast. Southern Cook Inlet back down toward Kodiak Island. Snow continues here along this trough from the low center over the Yukon Delta. And then an area of snow kicking eastward here with a trough and should bring some snow in the Kuskokwim Valley back to the low center there over the Seward Peninsula. Stays wet for the North Gulf Coast and Panhandle, but wind's not too much of a problem there. This system moving quite rapidly, bringing gale force winds into the central eastern Aleutians and in over the southeastern Bering Sea. That gets replaced by a stronger one that's off the chart here that moves in with gale and storm force winds associated with it right out of the south. Good warm air pulling up on those southerly winds, so rain all the way up to the warm front there with mixed precipitation to the north. Snow farther to the north here, Seward Peninsula, and along the trough there just south of the west central Brooks Range area. And the southeast coast, lingering showers, same thing for the North Gulf Coast. Coastal water forecast, south to southeast winds 15 to 20 knots there. Tomorrow, Central coast looking at southerlies at 20 to 25 knots, seas 11 feet. South to southeast at 25 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, south winds 20 knots. South at 20, gusts 35 knots there for Stevens Passage. South at 20 for Clarence Strait. Those winds will become west for Clarence Strait at 15 knots on Thursday, with south winds at 15 for Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal. And for the central and south coast here, we're looking at west winds at 20 knots for the day Thursday, otherwise variable 15 for the north coast. Small craft advisories for Cook Inlet tomorrow, north of the Forelands, southeast at 25, southwest 30 south of the Forelands, excuse me, and south at 20 for Kamishak Bay, 25 knots for the Barren Islands from the south, and the entire North Gulf Coast looking at the same thing, south winds at 25 knots, Prince William Sound southeast at 20. And then for the day on Thursday, for the North Gulf Coast, southwest winds 25 to 30 knots, south at 30 knots for the Barren Islands, Prince William Sound, south winds 20 knots, and gale warnings for Kamishak Bay, southwest 35, small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, southwest wind 25 to 30 knots, southwest at 30 for Bristol Bay. Gale warnings here for the Alaska Peninsula, west southwesterlies 30 to 40 knots. And then for the day on Thursday, Alaska Peninsula, even stronger gales coming in with that next system pulling rapidly northeastward there. So south winds 35 to 45 knots, south at 30 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, gale warnings, southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. And for the central and eastern Aleutians tomorrow, south to southwest winds 45 to 50 knots, and then southwest 40 to 50 knot winds from Adak to Kiska Island, turn northwest 45 to 50 knots from Kiska to Shimya. And then on Thursday, those winds from Kiska to Shimya northwest at 25. Otherwise, we've got storm force winds out or storm warnings for Adak and Atka for southwest and northwest winds of 50 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, good storm force winds there in the forecast. South 55 knots with seas anywhere from 13 to 20 or to 33 feet. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, Yukon Delta coast, west at 20 knots, west 15 for St. Lawrence Island. Brisk wind advisory for Norton Sound, southeast at 25. Otherwise, gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands, south at 35 knots, east winds 40 knots there for St. Matthew Island, west at 25 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. And then on Thursday, storm warnings move into the Pribilof Islands from the south, sustained at 50 knots, seas 20 feet, west winds at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island, Gale warning, south 40 knots for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, south at 25 for the Yukon Delta coast, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, south winds at 20. And for the Chukchi CC tomorrow, brisk wind advisory, north winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the western Arctic coast, brisk wind advisory also for northeast at 25, down to 15 knots there in the central coast, and then back up to east at 25 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. And then on Thursday, those winds become lighter here for the east side, 15 to 20 knots, or 15 knots from the east and north, north 15 for the central coast, northeast winds at 20 knots for the western Arctic coast and the Chukchi CC.